Hello, everybody. Some thoughts to prepare you for your second English literature paper. This is the paper where you'll be asked to think about Macbeth and some unseen poetry. So we're going to go through it. I'm going to tell you how to make sure that you do really, really well. It's difficult sometimes. I speak to students, and the things that they say sometimes tells me that I haven't been very successful in putting across to you the things that matter and the things that don't. So I was speaking to some students coming out of literature paper one the other day who were very concerned about how many paragraphs they'd written and how many paragraphs should you write. It really doesn't matter. What I want to try and get across in this video to help prepare you is that your written answers are marked and judged entirely on their quality. So the quality of your thinking, the quality of your argument, the actual genuine creativity of your ideas in some ways, and how well you deal with the extracts. And of course, you'll be dealing with a written extract for all of these tasks. That's the crucial thing. So it would be far better, rather than starting writing, just so you get down that mythical 5 paragraphs or 4 paragraphs or whatever, you'd be much better taking a minute or two more to think a little bit more deeply about the question or about the poem or about the extract, and to come up with a slightly more thoughtful argument or thesis, or a slightly better example, or getting a little bit more out of one of the examples that you choose, what it might suggest or symbolize. That would give you far more credit, actually, than writing an extra paragraph. So with that in mind, focusing on quality, let's pitch into this. So this paper's structured, it's an hour and 45, this paper. And unlike literature one, you are going to need to watch the clock. So you're not going to be given each section like you were the other day in 2 discrete 50-minute blocks. Your hour 45 this time is entirely up to you how you time it. So here's how to do it. You've got 50 minutes for Macbeth, I'd say. I think you've got to be really disciplined with yourself and only take 50 minutes. Read the question, highlight the extract, pick out the best things from the extract so you can really deal with the extract thoroughly. Plan what's going to be your overall thesis, your argument, what's going to be your really interesting take on the particular question that you're given. That should be about 5 minutes, but if you need to take 7 minutes and take 43 to write, that's better. Like I say, having a better idea is always better than just writing more. And you've got about 45 minutes to write that response. Be really disciplined, because loads of marks available for unseen poetry. This is split into 2 sections. The first section of unseen poetry, obviously you just get one unseen poem, and for 24 marks you have to analyse it. And so I'd suggest that that's actually rather similar to Macbeth. The only difference, the reason it's worth slightly fewer marks, and therefore the reason that I think you spend 10 minutes less on it, is that there are no marks for context. Because it's an unseen poem, you're not expected to know the context. So you got about 40 minutes there. Again, I'd say 5 minutes, but if you need something more like 7, 8 minutes, much better to have a better idea. And then you've got over half an hour to write that response. That leaves you with 15 minutes to go. So you should be looking at the clock, making a note. You need to leave 15 minutes for the last question. Not more than that. The last question will ask you to compare with the second unseen poem. And it's only worth 8 marks. So, you need to allocate your time in proportion to the credit available. There are 30 marks for Macbeth. There are 24 marks for unseen poetry. The first poem. There are only 8 for B. So leave 15 minutes to read the second unseen poem and write comparatively, but don't leave yourself more than that. In the mock, some people wrote as much for the unseen poem here that I've given you 40 minutes for. They wrote as much for that as they did for B. And that is just silly when one of them is worth 3 times the credit. Clearly, you need a more thoughtful, developed response for A. So they are the timings. Jot them down in some way, because you need to clock watch. You need to be really disciplined with yourself. Coming out of language, I spoke to a couple of students who had not heeded my advice on timings for language 1. And they said, oh, I thought I could borrow 5 minutes here. You really can't. You really can't. You've got to be disciplined and move on. Okay. Some thoughts then. Macbeth. This is the format of the question, as you should know. I've chosen this one because it's actually quite a difficult past paper question. You might have seen it, you might not have done, but you'll get this kind of thing. The thing that you read first is the question. So if this was me, I've opened my paper. The first, there's lots of Shakespeare that you can choose from, but of course we're choosing Macbeth. So this is the question actually that appears first in the Shakespeare section, so you won't have to do too much leafing through the paper. The first thing I'm reading here is the question. I'm not reading the extract yet. My eyes are going to go straight to the question, starting with this moment in the play. Explore how Shakespeare presents the attitudes of Macbeth and Banquo towards the supernatural. Now, this is I think the most complex question there's ever been previously. It's unlikely that your question will be, or your task rather, will be this complicated. But have a look at that, because again, the key thing here is that you end up writing something interesting about what you've been asked to write about. So don't look at this question and think, oh, I've seen the word supernatural. I'm just going to write about how Shakespeare presents the witches. Because the question is giving you something really specific. Macbeth's and Banquo's attitudes to the supernatural. So you've got to think, okay, well, how does Macbeth feel in this case? How does Macbeth feel about what the witches have prophesied? And how does Banquo feel about it? Do they feel similarly about what the witches have said, or do they feel differently? And you've got to decide that, because that's going to be your thesis. Now, Banquo, as the play goes on, of course, he's murdered and he's a ghost in Act 3. He turns up at the banquet, perhaps in Macbeth's, subconscious. He becomes a ghostly manifestation. But Macbeth carries on having attitudes towards the supernatural, because Macbeth goes back to visit the witches in Act 4. So, that's how your brain's going to start thinking about the question. Okay, when you've read the question carefully and highlighted key terms, now it's the extract. And I'm going to be reading this extract and I'm going to be thinking, okay, what does this seem to suggest about Banquo's attitude to the supernatural, Banquo's speech, and then Macbeth's attitude to the supernatural? And I'm going to look for little clues and cues. This is written in verse rather than prose. Macbeth's contribution there is an aside. It's a sort of mini soliloquy. So Banquo won't be able to hear that. So they're the things that you might notice immediately about the bit you've been given. But then it's about reading through carefully and highlighting examples of things that Shakespeare's done that give you a suggestion, give you an idea. How's Banquo feeling? How's Macbeth feeling? Now, don't worry if, when I saw this past paper, I thought, oh, actually, if I got this extract, I'd have to read it again carefully, because this is not a specific moment in the play that I know word for word. It's very unlikely that you'll get an extract from Macbeth that you know really well. That's pretty unlikely. It's a long play. Far more likely you get an extract that you don't know. And so almost treat it like an unseen. Treat it like the unseen poem. Read it as if you're reading it for the first time. Yes, you know about the play, but genuinely see what's there and what you can highlight and what you can pick out. And you're looking for the most interesting examples of, in this case, their attitudes to the supernatural. But another question might be something else. And that's the last thing I'm going to leave you with on Macbeth. Make sure your head is stuffed full of everything you know about the play. And that's great. But make absolutely sure that when you see what the question really is, that you let all those other thoughts go out of your head. Because as soon as you get your specific question, you've got to answer on that thing that they want. Don't bring in other things if they're not relevant just because you know them. And that can be really frustrating. You think, oh, I did loads of revision about Lady Macbeth. And look, if you'd revised Lady Macbeth here, you are going to have to look at this and you're going to have to go, well, actually, all of my Lady Macbeth stuff and my feminist reading of Lady Macbeth, I'm going to have to save that up for A-level because it's not relevant here. And I'm going to have to maybe have some new ideas I've never had before. If you've never considered Shakespeare, Macbeth's attitude to the supernatural, Banquo's attitude to the supernatural, and you might not have done in lessons, you've got to have those thoughts in the 5 minutes that you've got to plan. You've got to have those thoughts there and really go for it. A little bit like some people I think were slightly put out by the Jekyll question the other day, the extract from chapter 6, and then Jekyll is mysterious. Sometimes, things are phrased in a way that you might not have considered them perfectly like that in your revision, but use what you do know about the play to form an argument about that in those 5 planning minutes that you've got. Okay, so that's Macbeth. And of course, it goes without saying, it's not just about the extract. You're going to write about other things you know about the play, other quotations that spring to mind, but try to get a good balance so that you really deconstruct the extract thoroughly and then link to maybe other moments, a couple of other quotations that you know from elsewhere. Here's an example of then you'll move on after your 50 minutes and what the unseen poem will look like. This is an unseen poem from a past paper. This one's called The Richest Poor Man in the Valley. You can analyse titles, don't forget. Sometimes the title is very significant, and this is the case here. In The Richest Poor Man in the Valley, again, read the question first. How does the poet present ideas about living a happy and contented life? So I'm going to need a thesis when I read this poem about a happy and contented life. Now, when I read the poem a couple of times, I'm looking for what are the cleverest things I can say about language to do with the poet presenting ideas about a happy and contented life, and what are the cleverest things I can say about structure. This is very likely the sort of poem you'll get. They're often quite short, they're often quite modern. There's often symbolism in there. Look at line, 8. He cleared a thin silver path, things like that. There's often details that are symbolic or going to be symbolic. So you're looking for things the writer has done, because it's nice with unseen poetry to come in and say, the poet uses this technique. The poet creates a semantic field of, or two contrasting semantic fields. And then this suggests, what's the link with living a happy and contented life? This suggests how. Develop that as much as you can. So with unseen poetry, don't forget structure. Say the cleverest things you can about language and really delve in. Don't just quote and say what it means. When it says like money houses bank accounts, this shows that he doesn't care about material things. He much care. That's not great analysis. That's just almost summarizing what's there. Find a method and really dig into it. The enjambment between these two lines might suggest maybe this is a symbol for this. Try and find things that go a bit beyond the obvious. So you've got 40 minutes for this question. And when your 40 minutes is up, you are going to be comparing with a second unseen poem. Here's an example. And the question will always be, in both of them, the poets describe ideas about something that they have in common. What are the similarities and differences between the methods they use to present? Remember, these 8 marks are all given to AO2 techniques. So don't just spend your time discussing how the ideas in the poems are similar or different. You've got to be naming methods, naming techniques. What's different about the language they use or similar? The language techniques, what's different or similar about the structural techniques that they use? All of the 8 marks are available for that. You've got 15 minutes, spend a few minutes reading the poem, and then write. This is kind of the sprint to the finish, as much as you can on similar or different techniques. Remember your comparative connectives. Similarly, this one might have a harsher tone. This one might be structured in a freer way or a more formal way, or whatever. Use those connective phrases. And that is that. That will be your GCSE in English literature. A few key points. These are, again, like I said for paper 1, the highest impact things you can do. Make your argument interesting rather than simple. Really get into the extract. Don't just glance off the extract. Pick out 3 or 4 interesting things that you can say the cleverest things about. For both Macbeth and poetry, really taking those extra few sentences. When you put a quote in there, really dissect that quote. Tell me what it symbolizes. Find a suggestion hidden in there that other students might miss. Be the student that really takes a few more sentences to explore in detail. And for the poetry, don't forget structure. Don't forget structure. Loads of people will forget structure and they won't do quite as well. Don't be one of those students. Make a link to structure. And for the 8 marker, remember, that is all about AO2, about techniques. That's what you have to do for that one. I've made videos on what I think are the most perceptive ideas in Macbeth, and I've made a video on perceptive things you can say about unseen poetry generally as well. So have a look at those 2. But all in all, go in really confidently. You'll do brilliantly at this. You've studied these things for so much time. This is really a chance now for you to go in there and impress and show off and be confident. But the one thing I'll say, to return to the beginning of this video, it's not about how many paragraphs or how you structure your response. It's all about taking an extra minute and having a really good idea and being as clever as you can possibly be about the things that you're asked and the extracts that are presented to you. The very, very best of luck.